welcome. You're watching the News Unlocked, the show that goes beyond the headlines to the real stories that matter. The coronavirus pandemic has hit the country's economy hard. Last week, the latest World Economic Outlook released by the International Monetary Fund reiterated India's dire state and also suggested that India may actually be falling behind at some level behind some of its neighbors, in particular Bangladesh. Its Economic Outlook report places Bangladesh above India. That report has triggered, in some sections, outrage, denial, finger-pointing, and blame games. Today we try and answer the question, is Bangladesh really outpacing India's economic story? We'll be joined by Subramaniam, former Chief Economic Advisor and a leading voice from Bangladesh later as well. But first, our top story.
The International Monetary Fund's latest update on the World Economic Outlook has triggered outrage in India, because the IMF's 2020 estimation shows India's GDP contracting by over 10%, but that's not what caught the attention. It was the prediction that in the same year, the per capita income of an average Bangladeshi citizen would be more than the per capita income of an average Indian citizen. The projected difference is rather small, $1,888 to $1,877. And experts believe it will not last beyond this year.
I think there is no question of doubting the numbers. It has its standards procedure, and that has been followed in this case. In some indicators, India is doing better, and in some indicators, Bangladesh has been doing better for quite a while. So it's not like a competition between these two countries. Bangladesh is growing not because trying to bypass India. It's like Bangladesh has been on the growth path for a while.
So how did this happen? It is a fact that India's economy has always been bigger than Bangladesh's and has consistently recorded better growth. But what changed the trend wasn't just the pandemic. Bangladesh's economy has been clocking rapid GDP growth rates since 2004. This rapid growth rate, however, never saw the smaller nation overtake its giant neighbor. But since 2017, India's growth rate decelerated sharply while Bangladesh's grew faster. Since per capita GDP calculation takes in a country's population, India's rapid growth in population at 21% compared to Bangladesh's 18% affects the numbers. The per capita GDP gap had closed considerably even before Covid-19 hit. Bangladesh's per capita GDP was merely half of India's in 2007. It was roughly 70% of India's in 2014, and this gap closed rapidly in the last few years. Add to these the most immediate factor, the impact of Covid-19 on the two economies. While India's GDP is set to reduce by 10%, Bangladesh is expected to grow by almost 4%. So although the IMF projections paints a dire future for India's economy, India is still likely to grow faster in 2021.
And joining me now is the first of my special guests. I'm joined by Dr. Subramaniam, former Chief Economic Advisor to Government of India, one of the most noted economists. Appreciate your joining us, Dr. Subramaniam, because you have, in a way, defended India against the charge that we've fallen behind Bangladesh. The manner in which the IMF report seems to suggest that Bangladesh is overtaking India in terms of per capita GDP has evokes considerable controversy. Why do you believe that those numbers are not necessarily accurate?
Rajdeep, the famous saying is, we're entitled to our opinions, but not to our facts. Really, I was challenging the facts. I think we can get into the broader question of how well Bangladesh is doing, how India's growth is slipping, what needs to be done. But those are slightly independent from, the basis for this controversy. And essentially, the numbers that people were quoting are just not the right numbers to compare the standards of living of two countries. The numbers that were being quoted, this 1800, whatever number, these don't reflect the two things. One, how much inflation is taking place in a country, and also how productive the country is and how that's been going. So it's kind of standard operating practice that when you measure or compare standards of living across countries, you have to account for the fact that purchasing power may be different across countries. So when you do the comparison based on this purchasing power, essentially India was always ahead, and notwithstanding COVID, which we can come to in a second, India will remain ahead in terms of per capita GDP by about 20-25%, according to the IMF. We can also talk about whether per capita GDP is the only way of measuring how well an economy is doing. All those discussions we need to have, but the numbers being used for the comparison were, in my view, just wrong numbers to compare. That's the kind of technical point.
Right, because the numbers used in that World Economic Outlook report was GDP per capita in dollars 1876.53 for India and 1887.97 for Bangladesh. You're saying that's a flawed way to compare it. You've got to look at purchasing power, you've got to look at inflation before you make these comparisons. Am I correct?
Yeah, correct, exactly, yeah. And that's standard. It's not even, I don't think it's disputed really.
Okay, but Dr. Subramaniam, when you look at, and I think this is where it all triggered off, the projections for South Asian economies 2020-21, India minus 10.3%, Bangladesh 3.8% positive. And this in a COVID year has naturally led to some people to believe that Bangladesh has handled the COVID pandemic and its impact on the economy far better than India.
So I think that's why, Rajdeep, we should separate out the comparison that I'm disputing is more like a long-term comparison. Is it the case that because of how Bangladesh has done in the past and India has done in the past, whether Bangladesh has overtaken India on the standard of living? And my argument is that it's not the case. But that's a different question which you raise now. How have the two countries done in the pandemic and in responding to the pandemic? And there's no question that, if you look at the GDP growth numbers for 2020, this is something that I said long ago, India fares the worst amongst a number of major emerging market economies, and Bangladesh fares relatively well. So in the COVID year, there's no question that, not only has Bangladesh done better than India, many other countries have done better than India in terms of the impact on economic activity from COVID.
No, so that brings me to the question, Dr. Subramaniam, why? What explains this? Somewhere it seems to suggest that, what explains the fact that Bangladesh is able to do so much better in COVID year than India?
See, and I think, Rajdeep, I would say there are about, four factors that explain why India has done, relatively worse or much worse than other countries. I think point number one is something that my colleague Josh Feldman and I pointed out late last year. The Indian economy was weakening significantly going into COVID, and the financial system was very fragile going into COVID already. That was not true for Bangladesh. We were really, so the initial conditions were much worse for India. Second, I think that the lockdown, if you look at the numbers, were amongst the most severe in India, at least in the initial phase, than they were in Bangladesh and almost any other country in the world. We can debate about the rights and wrongs of that decision, but the fact is that the initial phase of the lockdown amongst the most severe in the world. Now, but having done the lockdown, that comes to the third reason. If the government had responded with fiscal firepower like many other countries had done, that cushion would have been, that adverse reaction would have been cushioned to some extent. If you look at the numbers, for example, in terms of the headline fiscal response to the crisis, amongst the major economies in the world, India is close to the bottom. For example, only Mexico and Turkey had a bigger response, fiscal response, according to the IMF, than most advanced economies. So a bigger, so weakening initial conditions, a much bigger shock because of the lockdown, a much softer, weaker response. And then finally, I think this is also what is quite, I think, unique about India, which we haven't given enough attention to, is that I think one dimension of the lockdown in India was how our labor markets got completely disrupted because of the migrant problem. So, so the disruption that came about to economic activity because migrants went back, there were shortages in some places. I think that has been fairly special to India, that labor movement and how much that's affected. So I think it's for these four reasons that I think India has, the impact has been much worse in India than in almost any other country in the world.
I want to also look at another factor. When I compare Bangladesh with India, the former Bangladesh's stellar export performance, especially in garments and apparel, contrast that with India, where there seems to be pessimism and exports have remained sluggish. The sense is that while India is pushing ahead towards Atmanirbharta and protectionism, Bangladesh has gone the other way around. They've sort of lowered rather than raised tariffs, embraced free trade agreement, sought greater integration with global supply chains. Do you believe that there are lessons we could learn in that sense, Dr. Subramaniam?
Yeah, so Rajdeep, again, now we're switching from the COVID to the bigger long-term response. Yes. And there, I think, Bangladesh is a really amazing success story when it comes to exports of low-skilled goods like clothing. I think we've just written a recent paper where we show that, India is underproducing or under-exporting in textiles and clothing by somewhere like $60 to $100 billion. And here, and we're not doing enough low-skill manufacturing in India. And there, Bangladesh has done a phenomenal job, which I think does offer a lesson for all countries, including India. But that's, again, more the longer-term picture, not the COVID picture. And I think the other area where I think all countries need to learn from Bangladesh is how they have managed to, improve these social indicators, infant mortality, labor force participation for women, fertility, health outcomes, financial inclusion. I think those are some of the really very interesting lessons that Bangladesh has to offer for really all developing countries.
That's right. Female labor participation, gender parity ranking, global hunger ranking, mortality rate attributed to unsafe water, unsafe sanitation, lack of hygiene, Bangladesh ahead of India on all those parameters. But in conclusion, Dr. Subramaniam, the short-term issue, since you mentioned the four concerns, the four reasons in a way why during COVID times perhaps the economy hasn't revived the way it is, your prescription going ahead to ensure that the economic outlook looks a bit better 3 months from now?
You see, again, I think, Rajdeep, almost by definition, all the numbers are going to look better in the next 3 to 6 months, by definition, because everyone is going to bounce back. But those are all should not be grounds for complacency. Because one of the things which I pointed out about the IMF report is that India will recover its pre-COVID level of real GDP per capita only after 3 years.
That's right. So we're going to lose 3 years, I think,
because of the COVID. And our starting point for the real recovery phase is going to be much weaker. The financial system is weaker, debt is weaker, deficits are weaker. So I think I would say that the complacency or the triumphalism that will come over the next 3 to 6 months because the numbers are looking better will exactly be the problems, because we have no room for complacency, because once the dust settles, we're going to have an enormous challenge of getting our economy back to where it used to be several years ago. Getting back 7-8%, real growth rates for long periods of time is a huge development challenge. And post-COVID, we're going to be much weaker, and therefore we need to do much, much more going forward. So my one, in fact, big lesson would be, almost we should ignore the numbers that come out for the next 3 to 6 months, because they are going to look better, but they will be misleadingly better. They're not going to say, oh, wow, we've turned the corner and we're back on the path of sustained long-run growth.
Okay, I think those are wise words as always from you, Dr. Subramaniam. I appreciate you joining us and giving us a sense of trying to make sense of the numbers that have created such a stir in the country. Stay well. As always, good to listen to you and good to talk to you. Thank you very much, Dr. Subramaniam. Now, that's one perspective. We want to also get a Bangladesh perspective and take a look at what is aiding Bangladesh's rapid growth. One of the key areas, the textile industry, especially the export of apparels, which accounts now for 80% of the country's total export earnings. About 16% of the country's GDP, employs over 4 million people.
The textile industry in Bangladesh is resilient, and while the initial lockdowns and cancellation of orders had hit growth, the industry adjusted to new international demands like that of masks and is making a faster comeback and helping Bangladesh's economy recover faster than the sluggish Indian one across the border.
The way COVID-19 has impacted Indian economy, for Bangladesh, the aggravation or the impact is not that much compared to India. So India has been hurt more by COVID-19 than Bangladesh. So, and also Indian economy is more exposed to the global economy, and therefore all the global crisis that has been in the COVID-19 has induced. All those global crises for this COVID-19 has hurt India more than Bangladesh.
Bangladesh is currently the destination for the world's garment buyers. With cheap labor and duty-free access to EU and Japan, it is possibly the cheapest place to make clothes in. The bulk of the raw material is sourced from China, which is also considering reducing duties on clothes manufactured in Bangladesh. But Bangladesh is set to lose its current privilege of EU zero-duty export benefit after its transition from a least developed country to a middle-income country status. The initial deadline was set in 2024, but the EU gives 3 years grace period, so the country will lose the existing facility in 2027, and that might impact its textile industry.
Let me then turn to a voice from Dhaka. I'm joined by Khondakar Ghulam Moizim, one of Bangladesh's top economists, research director at CPD. Appreciate your joining us, Dr. Moizim. Till 5 years ago, India's per capita GDP nearly 40% higher than Bangladesh's. Last 5 years, Bangladesh's per capita GDP growing at a compound annual growth rate of 9.1% against 3.2% reported by India during this period. What explains Bangladesh's ability to close the gap with India, Bangladesh's success? How did it reach such a level of economic well-being?
I think the most important thing that is happening over the last 5 years, I would say that political stability within the country, that has contributed in a broader sense. And along with that, significant public investment happened in some critical infrastructure, particularly energy and electricity, road transport, because these are the critical elements which significantly contributed economic activities of a densely populated country like Bangladesh. So that has also contributed. And at the same time, the favorable global environment that has helped to grow our export sector. You know that Bangladesh is overwhelmingly rely on ready-made garment sector, but it has done a lot during this time. And government's policy focus, especially on the agricultural sector, it has provided significant policy support for rice and non-rice based crops, livestock and poultry sector. That also has created a huge amount of production and employment. Most importantly, I would say that a favorable environment which has created enough jobs in most of the sectors, particularly some 3 critical sectors. We often mention it 3R. This 3R is remittance, ready-made garments, and rice. So in these 3 sectors, a huge amount of improvement happened over the last decade. And at the same time, employment has been created, which also contributed to reduce poverty and ensure sustained economic growth during this time.
Interesting, the 3 R's you to speak about: remittances, rice and ready-made garments. I'm trying to understand though, has this been driven by private enterprise? How much is this government led through SOPs and incentives that government has given to the apparel industry, to agriculture? Who's driving the Bangladesh growth story?
Bangladesh's major advantage in the ready-made garments sector is that it has specialized on low-value products, and it can produce at a bulk scale. For example, one factory may produce at 1 million pieces of cloths, which usually not happen in other countries. I know that in India is also ready-made garment sector is growing, but that also not that a large scale. So this scale effect is also an important part for Bangladesh's growth. But at the same time, Bangladeshi entrepreneurs over time has tried to diversify their garment products within the garment sector from low value to gradually to high, medium and high-end product. They are started to grow in that part, and government's policy support definitely has contributed there. Fiscal incentive provided to the ready-made garment sector, that has contributed. But I would say most importantly, the global policy support, particularly in the European market, Bangladeshi products enjoying the duty-free market access. That has also contributed a lot to grow Bangladesh's ready-made garment sector during this time.
You know, it is of course one of the big success stories, ready-made garment in Bangladesh. But I want to understand, in COVID times, at a time when India is facing minus 10.3% growth for 2021, Bangladesh's 3.8% is the IMF projection. You have a message for India on how to deal with COVID? So far, it's always India over the years that has given messages to Bangladesh. Do you have a message today for India?
I don't think that Bangladesh need to give a message at this moment. India has its own potential. India has its resources, capacities, intellects are all there. The thing happened in this year is, I would say, on an exceptional thing happened because India's economy has contracted. So that because of COVID, and Bangladesh some way took risk and opened it up its economy, and with less vulnerability and casualty of death because of the COVID. That's an advantage Bangladesh received. But one thing important for India would be to gradually focus more on labor-intensive industries. I think India over time has focused on non-labor-intensive, service-oriented sector. Definitely that is their advantage. But at the same time, there's millions of people there in India who live below the poverty, who need jobs, and those could be possible in the manufacturing sector, and already agriculture is there. So it need to expand its manufacturing base in the coming decades. That would create employment and reduce poverty and ensure an inclusive growth and ensure the higher GDP growth in the coming years.
Well, Dr. Moizim, you've given us a quick sense of why Bangladesh, the 3 Rs, as I keep reiterating, have been driving Bangladesh's economy: ready-made apparel, rice and remittances. Either way, you are a success story at the moment, and it's a remarkable story in the last decade. Thank you very much for joining us. We live and learn. We tried to go do a deep dive into India versus Bangladesh's economy. Thanks for watching News Without the Noise. Stay well.